So what we're going to do, I'm going to close out some of these, is we are going to add a model. And a model is simply a C# class. And it's basically a lot of properties. And we use models to define our business logic. And they are used to create tables in a database. And so you'll notice we don't have a models folder, so we're going to create one. I'm going to right click on Razor Pages here, and then I'm going to go to add a new folder, and I'm going to key in models. Okay, and the model that we are going to create is called movie, and it is a class. So we're going to right click, go to add and class. And I'm going to key in movie. Now it's automatically going to put .cs on the end because it's going to be a C# file. Okay, and it takes me in. And now I need to add my properties. And there's also a little using statement that I'm going to add to the top. And so namespace, Razor Pages, movies.models, that's all right. And this is like doing a normal class. There's nothing unusual here. And in fact, Visual Studio is super helpful. It's actually filled in the first one that I want to do. So I'm just going to press tab and then I'm going to press enter. And so this next one, oh, Visual Studio is so smart. I do want to add title. And so I'm just going to tab over this, but I am not going to make this required. So to make it optional, I'm going to put a question after string. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and key in all the properties first, and then we're going to add something called a data annotation. And so I will tell you what that is in a minute. This next one is a date time property, and it is release date. And then the get set is correct, so I'm just going to tab over that. And my next one is public string is correct. Actually, everything is correct except for description. So I'm just going to tab. And then I am going to put genre in here. And actually, you probably noticed it wanted to put string empty on the end. That is fine. You can initialize it to string.empty. That is absolutely not a problem. Okay, if you want to do that. You can actually do that for title as well. Okay, not a problem. And for the next one, this is our last one actually. This is going to be price. And it's not nullable, so we're not going to put the question mark in. And this also needs a get set. All right, so these are the properties that are going to end up being in our table. And by default, in Razor Pages, it utilizes Entity Framework to communicate with the database. And one of the conventions or defaults is that the primary key, if you create a property with the name ID, that becomes the primary key. And that just so happens to be exactly what we want. So that is why we put it there. Okay. The only additional thing we want to do is we want to add a little format for our date. And the brackets are for data annotations. And I know that we talked briefly about these. But when we get into frameworks, especially frameworks where we are generating tables in a database, we use data annotations a lot because they basically tell Entity Framework how we want the data formatted. And they give us some control over how the data is formatted, not only in the table itself, but how it's formatted when we view it in the app. So they're actually pretty powerful. So we are just saying that the data type that we want for this date time is date. That is the data type that we want. And then up at the top, you may notice, because I did not key this in, it went ahead and added the component model data annotations using statement. If your Visual Studio did not do that, key that in, because that is required for data annotations that modify the appearance of the data. Okay, and we are going to be adding other data to annotations a little bit later, so you will be seeing a couple more. Once we have our class, I'm going to save. And at this point, we can actually, and this is what is so cool about Entity Framework and Razor Pages and MVC. We can take this class that is going to become a table, and we can actually generate all of the CRUD functions. So we can generate a page that will create an entry. So it'll have all of these fields in it. We can generate a page for editing, for viewing, for all of that. And so we do that by scaffolding. So what we're going to do is we are going to add a new folder into Pages, and we're going to call it Movies. And that is where all of the create, the edit, the view, all of these pages that we generate are going to be placed. So we're going to right click here, go to Add and New Folder, and we're going to call it Movies. And then we are going to give the command to actually scaffold and create those pages. So we want the pages to go in here. So that is what we are going to right click on. Okay, so we are going to go to New Scaffolded Item. And we are working with Razor Pages. And what we want is Razor Pages using Entity Framework CRUD. CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. And so it's going to be generating those pages for us. And you see the names of the pages that we're going to see are Create, Delete, Details, Edit, and List. It's going to create all of those pages for us. So we're going to click on Add. And now in order for it to generate those pages, we have to tell it the name of the model. And so our model is called Movie. And in order for it to generate a database, it needs a database context class. And we don't have one. So we can tell it to create one for us. Now, in this class, we are going to be having it generate the context class. In the MVC class 218, CIT 218, you will learn how to create your own. Okay, but for this class, we're going to have it generate. So we're going to click the plus sign. And so this is what it is going to call it, and that is fine. So we're going to click on Add. The database provider is SQL, so that is fine. And so we do want it to use the layout page. That was the page that I showed you, has all of our navigation in it. So it is going to use that page. And we're just going to click on add. And so what it is doing right now is it's installing Entity Framework for us. You can see it's updating dependency information. So all of the Entity Framework commands run. And now it's generating code. So it is creating the index page, the details page, the create page, all of those pages for us. So at this point, it is done. And if we expand out movies, you see that it has created all of those pages for us. Okay, and the really cool thing is that they will all work. Okay, in fact, if I run this, we don't have it in our menu yet, but we can get to it. So we can just do a /movies, which was our little folder that we created. And then if we do a /, by default, it's going to take us to the index, or it should. Maybe not. Let's key in index and see if we can get there. It's working on it. Oh, we haven't done a database yet. So jumping the gun a bit. We can't do that until we generate our database. Okay, so just trust me that these will work once we generate the database. But what you can see when you look is that they are HTML pages. So I'm looking at the create page. This is a form. Okay, so we have a form. It does include some validation. This validation that is put in here by default is going to display error messages in the span tag. So for those of you that have taken the 190 class, this is kind of how we set up error handling in that class to display in a span tag, and that is what it does here. You can control the error message that is displayed. If you don't like the default ones, there is a way to tell it in the model itself what error message you want. And we'll be taking a look at that later on. But if you take a look at all of these, okay, you will see that they're pretty much forms that display the data. Okay, and then usually at the bottom, there's a link or a button that will take you back. So you can see here's a submit button. Here's a link that takes you back to the index. Okay, so we'll take a look at these pages live once we generate our database. Now, in order to generate the database, we have to have a context file, which we generated. Let's take a look at the context file. So for every class that you have a model for, a model class, you need a database set. Okay, and so what this does is it looks at the class that you have in the models folder, and it is going to generate a table. This is going to be the name of the table. So, I mean, you could change it, but the default is to name the table the same as the class. Okay, so this is going to be the name of the table. And so we don't really have to do anything else. We generated it for us. So it is all set to go. Now, there were some changes made to Program CS. We'll take a look at that. So before we just had created the builder object and then it added services, but now you can see that it is adding services for a database. Okay, so these are services for the Razor pages, but now it's adding services for the database. And it's actually looking at the context file that we just looked at. And then it's indicating that it is a SQL Server database that we're creating. And the connection string that it is looking at is actually located in this JSON file. Okay, so what this command does is it is connecting the context up here, which indicates, where the class is that contains, the properties that are going to become our columns. And this file then is included here, and it is connecting it with this get connection string, which basically is telling us where the database should be located. So this is a local database. So it's going to be on my computer. The name of the database is going to be this very long name. That you can change. I mean, you don't have to have all of those numbers. You have to have the semicolon at the end, but you could just call it movie, movie database. You do not have to have all of that. Okay, just so you know. And so the rest of these are just settings for the database. And it is pulling all of that in this one statement. Okay, so it's pulling information from here. It is pulling information from here. And it's going to use that to build and configure our database and our tables. Okay, also up at the top, you'll notice we have a couple extra using statements. We've got Entity Framework Core, which we did not have before. We also have Razor Pages movie data, which we did not have before. So it has added those. So it's basically pulling in the classes that we need in order to run this application. So at this point, we are ready to actually create the database. So to do that, we have to be in the Package Manager console. Now, I have done this quite a bit, so I actually have mine docked down here. I'm guessing you don't have it docked out here. So there is a couple different ways to get into it. You can go to Tools and do Get Package Manager and open the Package Manager console this way. I believe you can also get to it by right-clicking over here. And I think the Package Manager console is somewhere in here as well. But the bottom line is you do need to open up this Package Manager console because this is where we give the command to create the code that it's basically a SQL code that it's going to use to create our database and our table. So the way that we create this code is we do, it's an initial migration. So our first migration, we do add migration, which is the command, and then we give it a name. And since this is the first one, we're going to call it initial create. And stuff in yellow is not a big deal. Okay. Stuff in red is a big deal. If you see anything highlighted in red, it's an error and it did not work. Okay. So just keep that in mind. Yellow is no big deal. So what this first command does is it adds a migrations folder, and in that is the code that it's going to use to actually create the database and the tables. And so you can see it's very SQL-like. We've got migration builder.create table. The name of our table is movie. Here we've got columns. And so this is the ID column. Then we've got title, release date, genre, and price. Okay, it has identified ID as the primary key, so that's a constraint. And then if we did remove the migration, it would drop the table, which deletes it. Okay, so this first little method that's created is an up method. It's used to create the database and tables. And then the second one is called a down method, which is used to remove them. Okay, the actual database and tables are not created yet. Okay, all we've done at this point is generate some code that will create them if we decide to run it. And we are going to go ahead and run it. Now, to run the code in the package manager console, we just key in update-database. Okay, and if you look, you should see some SQL code. So this is your SQL code for those of you that have had the 178 class. Okay, so what it's done is it's taken this code that was in initial create here, and Entity Framework has read through that code and converted it into actual SQL commands. So as long as you don't see anything in red, that means that this worked. Okay, and what we can do now is we can actually run the app and we won't get an error. And we can actually see the database and the tables. So I'm going to go ahead and run the app. And now when I key in /movie, and /index, hopefully it'll work. All right, let me try this. There's nothing to view yet, so let's try creating one. All right, we'll try this again. Okay. And let me make sure that the folder is called movie. Movies. That's why it didn't work. It always helps if you name things or type them incorrectly. There we go. So this is the index. And if you have movies, it will list them. But you'll also notice there's a create new because we can create a new movie. I am actually not, well, we can. I think we'll delete it right away because we're going to end up creating some seed data. But just so you can see. So I'm following along with the tutorial. And here's the date. And because we put in that property that said date format, that is why we only see date and not time. Okay, if I show you here in our class, when we said data type .date, but we have date time here, normally it would ask for the time too, but we are telling it in this data annotation that we don't want time, we just want the date. Okay, so what do they want? You can either use this dropdown or you can just key it in. And the genre is a Western. Pretty cheap price. We'll go ahead and click create. And it returns to the index, and now we can see it. Details will show this all by itself in a screen. And if we go to edit, we can make changes. And if we want to delete it, we can. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to kind of pause the video and we will be moving along with our next section, which is taking a little closer look at our scaffolded pages.